Greetings, everyone. Russia is truly the largest country on the planet. But did you know that a part of its territory, as big as Australia, is quietly slipping away from its grasp without a single shot being fired? Amidst the Russia-Ukraine war that is burning up all resources in the West, a massive demographic and geopolitical crisis of self-destruction is unfolding in the distant Far East. The main developments in today's video, the Great Exodus. Why is the region that makes up 40% of Russia's territory experiencing this? Sitting atop the planet's largest resource trove, yet it's becoming a deserted wasteland. The brutal aftermath of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, military mobilization orders, and wartime budgets, how have they drained the core workforce in the Far East? The truth behind the silent termination of the major aviation project. The move to trade land for allies to compensate for the labor shortage. Moscow has accepted high-risk deals with Pyongyang and Beijing. How are tens of thousands of North Korean workers and economic and demographic penetration from China changing the Russian Far East? With the possibility of internal secession, is the idea of a united Chinese Siberia still a fantasy when the ethnic structure here has completely changed? Here is the content and detailed analysis. The Far East is collapsing, 25% of the population vanished, and China quietly annexed territory the size of Australia. Ladies and gentlemen, on the global geopolitical map, the Russian Federation stands tall as a unique geographical entity, spanning 2 continents, stretching across 11 time zones, and encompassing more than 17 million square kilometers of territory, a vast scale that surpasses the United States by 70%. However, right in the heart of this geographical empire, a silent yet fierce tragedy is unfolding, as a vast stretch of land equivalent in size to the entire continent of Australia is gradually slipping out of Moscow's grasp. This is not a humiliating military defeat in the face of a rebellion or an invasion campaign from a foreign power. It is a migration without gunfire, a quiet wave of people leaving their homeland as they simply pack up and go, never to return, leaving behind vast empty spaces. The epicenter of this demographic crisis is the Russian Far East, or more specifically, the Far Eastern Federal District, which accounts for 40% of the country's total area. But there are only about 8 million people living here, which is less than 5% of Russia's total population. This borderland is experiencing a terrifying rate of population decline, faster than any period in modern Russian history, turning it into one of the most depleted regions on the planet, second only to the remote far north. Faced with this reality, President Vladimir Putin has had to frankly admit that this is a direct threat to national security. That strategic assessment is absolutely correct, because the Russian Far East is not only an endless treasure trove of resources, but also a vital trade gateway and a protective barrier against waves of migration and geopolitical influence from the East. However, a bitter paradox is that whenever the Kremlin tries to take action to change the situation, its policies always hit the harsh wall of reality, and the Russian Far East continues to sink deeper into a slow but irreversible decline. This demographic decline is paving the way for the worst-case scenario for Moscow, the risk of being completely overwhelmed by China. If this happens, it will mark a bitter historical setback, completely reversing the territorial gains that the Russian Empire achieved in 1860 through historic treaties. China has been quietly involved in this region for many years, and the war in Ukraine has acted as a catalyst, rapidly accelerating that process. Now, Moscow needs Beijing more than ever. But far more than Beijing needs Moscow, and the price for this strategic dependence is being paid with the very territory of the Russian Far East. By 2025, Chinese investment in the Russian Far East is expected to reach nearly 1 trillion rubles, equivalent to about 13.5 billion USD. The volume of trade between the Khabarovsk region and China increased by 5 million tons in 2024 and continued to surge by another 36% in just the first 6 months of 2025. China is essentially taking over the Russian Far East's economy, diverting its former foreign trade flows toward itself. But there's an even scarier card to play: demographics. Currently, about 500,000 Chinese citizens are estimated to live and work in the region from Vladivostok to the Ural Mountains. This number is continuously increasing thanks to visa-free agreements and priority access to Russia's most rapidly developing territories. The special economic zones that Moscow initially created to attract investment and retain its own citizens have now changed direction. They have proven to be much more effective at attracting waves of Chinese laborers instead of retaining native Russian citizens. Strategic intelligence from the Ukrainian Foreign Intelligence Service has revealed an astonishing reality. In a series of cities and settlements scattered across the Far East, new demographic enclaves are forming, where the presence of Russians has almost completely disappeared from the workforce. It is essential to recognize that ethnic Russian citizens living here are not indigenous residents, nor are they naturally adapted to the harsh cold of the vast Siberian region. In reality, they are descendants of waves of migrants who were relocated here by the Soviet authorities with promises of a prosperous life and superior economic privileges. In terms of identity and culture, they are more closely connected to the European part of Russia in the West than to this frontier land. Meanwhile, the indigenous population here has deep historical and ethnic ties with Mongolia and China. An already complex factor has now become even more sensitive as a new wave of immigration arrives, creating underlying tensions that are difficult to reconcile within society. Behind this demographic resistance lies the geopolitical shadow of China. Beijing has never forgotten a historical truth from before the year 1860. The vast outer Manchuria region was once an inseparable part of China's territory during the Qing dynasty. In fact, in recent years, in internal maps and documents, the Chinese government has openly restored ancient Chinese names to cities under Russian sovereignty in the region. Of course, this move does not signal a massive mechanized advance across the border to reclaim what was lost more than a century ago. In fact, Beijing has absolutely no need for an expensive war when the economic policies of Moscow are already failing. Combined with the burden of military mobilization orders and wartime calculations, this has pushed the local population into exhaustion, paving the way for a broad organic infiltration. To avert this severe labor shortage crisis, the Kremlin has taken a risky and self-destructive move by replacing Russians with a special labor force from East Asia. Moscow has joined hands with Pyongyang in a highly pragmatic labor supply agreement. Official data records that more than 15,000 North Korean workers have flooded into Russian territory during 2024 and early 2025, with their main destination being the Far East region due to its geographical proximity and severe labor shortage. However, independent sources estimate that the actual number will approach 50,000 people by the end of 2025, and Russian economic corporations in the region are still actively submitting applications for approval of an additional 153,000 new North Korean labor contracts. This demand shows no signs of cooling down, despite the reality. The harsh reality is that the working conditions of North Korean workers are described as no different from modern-day slavery, with work shifts lasting 18 hours a day and only 2 days off throughout the entire year. The nature of this exploitative cycle clearly exposes who benefits the most. North Korean workers are only paid the minimum wage according to nominal legal frameworks. The huge gap between what Russian companies pay and the actual income workers receive is sent directly back to Pyongyang, becoming one of the most important sources of hard currency to sustain the regime of leader Kim Jong-un. That's why North Korea has every strategic incentive to maintain and promote this agreement under the current terms, with absolutely no reason to make any concessions. This situation leads to a highly ironic political outcome. Two nuclear-armed countries, China and North Korea, are simultaneously establishing a deep presence within Russian territory. Through different means, one with financial power, the other with cheap labor, they are realizing a strategic outcome, establishing an increasingly deep presence in a region where Russia itself has lost the ability to provide manpower, finances, and governance with its own citizens. Western and Ukrainian intelligence analysts unanimously believe that the Kremlin is using its ancestral territory to pay for its war gamble in Ukraine, a desperate attempt to trade land for military victory and political stability at home. However, by doing this, they have accidentally triggered a ticking time bomb inside Russia. A major domestic political effect, often overlooked by international media, is the significant shift in the Far East's ethnic makeup due to ethnic Russian migration. In some strategic cities, the total population of Chinese and Uzbek immigrants now matches the remaining Russian residents. In that context, Russian social activists have begun to openly discuss the idea of establishing an independent Siberian entity. The concept of a Sino-Siberia, which initially emerged only as a futuristic art trend, is now gradually transforming into a powerful political ideology and a strong separatist cultural identity. Although these dialogues are currently still in the minority and mainly conducted from abroad due to the wave of Russian intellectuals fleeing when the war broke out, we cannot underestimate their broader context. Throughout a quarter century in power, President Vladimir Putin has eliminated all expressions of local national identities to impose the doctrine of Russia first, even going so far as to undermine the independence of post-Soviet states to keep them firmly within the orbit of the Federation. A potential separatist movement is emerging in the region where Moscow is least able to intervene. Due to the vast geographical distance and the exhaustion of institutions, local infrastructure shows that the Kremlin's internal political system is on the verge of fracturing. If the central government shows any sign of weakening, the state's propaganda messages will immediately lose their effectiveness, and the indigenous communities will instantly join forces with the separatist groups. This tragedy is unfolding across a vast geographical space that holds some of the greatest resource treasures on the planet. From endless forests of timber, inexhaustible seafood reserves, to rare earth mines, diamonds, gold, and massive oil and gas fields. This land lies right on the border with China, Japan, and North Korea, and is separated from Alaska and the United States by only the narrow Bering Strait. However, Putin has failed to keep Russians from leaving, allowing that demographic vacuum to be filled by waves of Chinese and North Korean people. In the coming century, as the value of these untapped resources rises and fierce geopolitical shifts occur among the world's great powers, the crucial question will no longer be who owns this land on paper, but rather who is actually present there to run the economy, fill the cities, exploit the resources, and decide which nation's interests will be served. According to statistics from the 1989 census, the land that is now the Far Eastern Federal District was once home to about 10.35 million people. By the time President Putin came to power, this number had dropped to about 8 million, and by 2025 estimates show that the population here will be only 7.86 million people, meaning that a quarter of the population, about 25%, has disappeared in just 35 years. Even more alarming, since the beginning of Putin's era of power, the population of the Far East has decreased by another 10%, and grim statistical forecasts indicate that this region will lose another 8% of its population before 2033. This rate of decline is 3 times more severe than the official forecast made just a few years earlier, showing that the downward spiral is accelerating rapidly. Today's Far East is even more sparsely populated than it was in the mid-1970s. All the labor achievements, sweat and blood, and enormous resources that the Soviet authorities poured in for decades to build and settle this land have now been almost completely wiped out in just the past 30 years. In the past, the Soviet Union filled the Far East using a combination of administrative measures, including some brutally coercive tools. The forced labor system was the foundation for building the first infrastructure in the wild Far East, especially in the Northeast. But in the post-Stalin era, the Kremlin shifted to a smarter strategy, stimulating the economy with attractive privileges. The wages of those who agreed to move to the Far East were raised significantly, even up to double the national average. Not stopping there, migrant workers moving east were also allowed by the state to retain ownership of their homes in their hometowns, a crucial safety net in the Soviet housing distribution system. The savings from the high wages, combined with the relatively low cost of living in the Far East, made living in this harsh land a temporary sacrifice. People were willing to endure hardship for a few years in exchange for a secure future and prosperous life when they returned to the warmer, more modern, and densely populated West. The central government both granted privileges and controlled institutional commitments, while also investing its own funds to build infrastructure and social systems to help people cope with the harshness of nature. As a result, the net migration flow into the East remained positive until the final years of the 1980s. Then a political earthquake erupted and the Soviet Union collapsed, causing the entire support system to dissolve overnight. The workers who had devoted their youth to the distant East suddenly realized that their housing rights back home had vanished into thin air, and all their lifelong savings were swallowed up by inflation and the collapse of the financial system. In a state of panic, their only rational choice was to flee immediately, doing whatever they could to escape this dying land before it was too late. Entering 1991, a dark milestone was set when, for the first time in Soviet and Russian history, the number of people leaving the Far East surpassed the natural population growth rate. Life in the Russian Far East is now defined by high costs, hardship, danger, and in return, unequal social benefits, a situation that is getting worse with each passing year. In the mid-1990s, wages in the Far East still maintained a value significantly higher than the national average, about 71% higher, thanks to coefficients and allowances left over from the Soviet era during the period of institutional transition. But by the late 2010s, that core competitive advantage had dropped to just 18%. While wages were being squeezed, the cost of living in this region was unreasonably high compared to the western part of Russia. To make matters worse, the healthcare system was streamlined and cut from small settlements, leaving the majority of people here completely isolated from basic healthcare services. In response to widespread depopulation, the management system mechanically closed many schools. But this very decision became a fatal blow, pushing even more young families into a wave of migration, creating a negative feedback loop. Those who were still hesitant, but had enough financial means to leave, immediately decided to take their chances in other regions when they witnessed such a bleak prospect. As a result, most of the people who stayed behind were the elderly, the poor, and those whose lives depended entirely on the meager support from the national budget. And so, the next generation of young people, when they grow up, face the same bitter choice as those before them, pushing this land toward an old fate, but with even more devastation and exhaustion. And all the preferential policies that Putin gave to this place completely vanished when Russia decided to launch a military campaign in Ukraine in 2022, pouring all national resources into a war that was originally calculated to last only 10 days. This conflict has dealt devastating blows to the Far East region on many different fronts. The most direct and painful impact is the military mobilization order. The campaign in Ukraine has disproportionately drained manpower from territories already suffering from severe labor shortages, and the Far East is one of the hardest hit areas. Men of working age are the backbone for maintaining any economic activity in a land that is always in need of manpower. Now, they have been sent to the front lines, killed, wounded, or have fled abroad to avoid conscription. On the international stage, Moscow always portrays itself as a superpower, re-establishing order in its neighboring spheres of influence, breaking the Western encirclement and flexing its muscles in Ukraine. But there is a harsh truth. They are failing to protect the integrity of their own territory by the most basic and fundamental measure of sovereignty, which is keeping their own people on the land of their homeland. Russia will not lose the Far East, and there will not be a large-scale separatist uprising breaking out in the short term. The Far East, after all, is just the opening chapter in the grand plan that China has for Russia's future. So, in your opinion, is Russia handing over the Far East to China in exchange for support in the current Russia-Ukraine war?